Well, hi everyone, and welcome to the Engage podcast. Peter, it's very good to see you. How are you?
I'm doing well, thank you. It's good to see you too.
I have had a bit of feedback on this podcast.
Go on.
And I've been wanting to tell you about it for quite some time. Why are you sounding so nervous?
Well, I feel like I can guess which direction this might go in.
No.
But go on.
I'm going to surprise you now. One of the great and the good of the evangelical constituency has said that you and I make a tremendous podcast pairing.
Very good.
Isn't that exciting?
That is exciting.
And what's amazing about that is that you are like my sixth choice. I mean, everyone else turned me down, and then you were like way too eager. So I was almost an act of like sympathy and pity. I'm like, yeah, okay, we'll let Peter on the podcast. He's so excited.
I mean, he says this. I'm pretty sure we were the ones who were convincing him to go for a podcast in the first place.
Yeah, it's true. No, I was nervous. I was nervous about doing this podcast. Do you know why I was nervous about doing this podcast?
Go on.
Well, I was nervous about doing this podcast because, I like to create a bit of a mystique about myself, I like to reveal very little of myself publicly. I don't like to be too out there in front of people because that way you create a kind of aura.
And that is why James is our director of church engagement and communications, both two public-facing roles.
I know, it's an accident. No one's quite sure how it happened, to be honest with you. Anyway, you're looking resplendent in a pink shirt.
Thank you.
And obviously, we're both actually wearing shorts. You can't see that probably on camera, but that's because of the heat, the oppressive heat. And talking about heat, it's been hotting up in Parliament as well. What a link. What a link.
That is a seamless transition.
Well, yeah, that's why I'm director of communications and engagement right there, peeps. I can't believe I just said the word peeps on this podcast. Okay, weird things are about to happen. Let's get back to task. What do we make of the first few weeks, I guess actually it's coming up for a month.
It is, yeah.
The first month of a new Labour government. What are some of your kind of big picture reflections?
I think it's probably much as people would have expected, isn't it? In that you have an initial kind of graciousness as you are kind of all very nice to one another, saying, thank you for all you've done previously and congratulations on winning the election. And you end up with it not necessarily remaining that way for terribly long. No. And that was brought home probably in the last few days with the speech by Rachel Reeves in the Commons and indeed Jeremy Hunt's riposte to it, both of which were fairly forthright.
Yes, let's talk about this then. So this is one of the big kind of moments that's happened since the government was changed and since Labour took power. So then this past week, the Chancellor Rachel Reeves gave her first major statement on the state of public finances. And it's worth just reflecting on the kind of the big messages that she landed. So the main thing that she said was she accused the previous government of hiding a £22 billion funding gap for the current financial year. So the idea is that basically the Tories, in an act of dastardly secrecy, just kind of squirreled away and hid from even the Office of Budget Responsibility the fact that they were digging into reserves to cover things like money needed for processing asylum seekers and for the Rwanda scheme. And so this is all about Rachel Reeves saying the state of public finances are a lot worse than we thought, and therefore she is quite clearly rolling the pitch for tax rises in the budget, which is due to be held on October the 30th, I believe. Or 20th. Was it 30th or 20th? October 30th,
I think, is
30th, the official.
Yeah. Yes, and I guess that's not necessarily a great surprise to lots of us in that it was predicted that she would be creating a case for tax rises. Labour was quite careful and cautious in its manifesto plans around tax. It didn't really want to say that it was going to put taxes up, because that's not going to be a great pitch to the electorate. People, I guess, have also historically had less trust for Labour on the economy than for the Conservatives, and so they were playing it very softly. We talked about the Mingvar strategy before. But I think lots of us thought that this would come, and I guess it has come quite quickly.
I also think in the background to this is that Labour, I think, have a real sense that they failed to respond properly to the narrative that the Tories and the Liberal Democrats crafted back in 2010 after the election then, and the famous note that was left in the drawer for the Chief Secretary to the Treasury saying there's no money left. Yeah. I think that for Labour, that scarred them terribly. And so I think you get a sense here, this is them really trying to pin the bad financial situation that they've inherited on the Tories as a kind of way of better responding to bad economic circumstances than they've done previously. I mean, just to be really clear on the numbers. So the government have a policy where they keep £9 billion in reserve. And this is for genuine emergency spending. And what Rachel Reeves is saying is that actually £6.4 billion of that I'm getting my figures all a bit mixed up, but effectively what they were doing was dipping into that 9 billion and spending it 3 times over in order to cover different things, including costings around asylum spending and so on. And so she set out plans for the government to recoup £5.5 billion this year and then £8 billion next year. And she's written to all government departments and said, you've got to find up to £3 billion of savings across these departments. I mean, it's sounding a lot like austerity, to be honest with you. This is exactly what happened in 2010.
Yeah, and I guess the other part to this too is, what did we get from the Conservatives in the months leading up to the election? Well, we ended up with tax cuts, didn't we?
Yes, we did.
And the criticism at the time was that those tax cuts were not being funded properly.
Yes, and this was specifically cuts in national insurance that we will all have to pay.
Yeah. So the case which Labour can make is how irresponsible have the Conservatives been. They've spent all this money, they've brought in less income.
Yes.
And so Labour are now kind of painting themselves, understandably, as we've got to kind of restore stability and we've got to get it all sorted again.
Yeah, the flip side is that the accusation against Labour is that on the same day that Rachel Reeves is coming out saying that the public finances are in an absolute state, it's far worse than we thought, and she's laying the blame squarely at the former government's door, then the Labour government also just issued and accepted the public pay body's recommendations for pay increases for doctors and for teachers and so on and so forth. And so you have this massive injection of cash in order to fund big pay increases, including a 22%, I believe, pay increase for junior doctors. And the ending, thank goodness, of the strike. And their argument, Labour's argument, will be this is a long-term saving, because the cost of having to get temporary staff in to cover for striking doctors is so much that actually by giving them a big pay increase to bring them, in line with inflation, not just this year, but in previous years, actually we're going to make a saving because we're not going to have to pay for people to come in and cover. That whole thing, it's a bit of a paradox. On the one hand, you're able to afford massive public sector pay increases. On the other hand, you're saying the state of the finances are absolutely awful. This is politics, right?
Yeah, and it's also worth saying that Labour's narrative has not gone unchallenged by the Conservatives, has it?
No, that's very true.
Jeremy Hunt was pretty clear in his disdain for what Rachel Reeves had said in the Commons, and he's written to the head of the civil service. He's sort of asking, well, how is it that the civil service was signed off the government spending plans when he was in government? Have the civil service made a mistake? Or have they been truly impartial? So there have kind of been some pretty big questions.
I mean, it's massive.
These being raised about the integrity of the civil service.
That's right. These are constitutional questions. And I also, again, just to be absolutely clear, one of the big kind of controversial things that came out of the Chancellor's statement was that she's cutting the winter fuel allowance. Now, this was something that Gordon Brown introduced and applied to all pensioners effectively. And what Rachel Reeves is saying is that from now on, actually, it will only be for those whose pension is means tested or who receive benefits connected to the pension that is means tested. And so you're going to see a massive reduction in terms of the cost of the winter fuel allowance. Now, as part of me that thinks if that means that pensioners who truly need it get it, I fully support this, because how is it fair that you have in this country, you have millionaires who are pensioners. They do not need a winter fuel allowance. It is insanity. I mean, there's a great story that I read on the Spectator website from Fraser Nelson about a friend of his who's a pensioner and a millionaire. And every year when he received his winter fuel allowance, he'd buy a bottle of champagne and he would then have it with some friends. Now, I mean, you can just see, surely this is just a long overdue reform. And again, from a Christian perspective, don't I want to make sure that those who need help the most are those who receive it? And I don't want to be in a situation where we're giving handouts to those who don't need the help.
Yeah, I think that's right. I almost wonder whether it's worth us pausing at this point and thinking what a Christian position on tax would be.
Yes, that's a great question.
Because on one level, all of us like the idea of not paying terribly much tax.
Yes.
We also want to kind of get great public services.
Yes.
And so generally British thinking on tax, I think, tends to be an absolute have your cake and eat it. Oh yeah, we want a fantastic NHS, but we don't actually want to have to pay for it.
I totally agree with this. Yeah.
Or similarly, like, well, why don't we just kind of throw more money at the trains or to kind of stop the boats or all these big problems? We would love to just kind of wave our magic wand, not spend the money for it, and they just disappear.
Well, I mean, the messaging is so ridiculous at the moment, because I read an article that was basically like, what the government need to do is get us all to spend all the money that we've saved during COVID, for example, when we weren't out and about. And I kind of think, gosh, you know what? Frankly, I'll decide what I want to do with my savings. Thank you very much. I don't want the government to pressurize me into doing anything with my savings. If I want to spend them on something, I will spend them on something. If I don't, I will not. And I also sort of think you're absolutely right. There's this kind of strange thing where we need to be more honest about the fact that we want our cake and we want to have it and eat it. And the government need to be more honest, and their messaging needs to be more direct. You cannot have a free at the point of use National Health Service that works unless we put up your taxes. So if you don't want tax increases, then the payoff, the trade-off, is we're going to have to completely reform the NHS.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right.
Honesty, right?
And in fairness, on the NHS, generally studies have shown people would be willing to have a tax rise in order to fund more money for the NHS. Just going back to something you picked up on there, I was just reminded of something I was reading in an essay by C.S. Lewis a couple of nights ago.
Didn't take long. We're only a few minutes into this podcast recording, and you have mentioned C.S. Lewis.
Well, in fairness, I don't think we've mentioned him that much.
Pray silence. You always adopt a special tone when you speak about C.S. Lewis.
Well, no, but I was just fascinated by what you were saying there about the government basically saying that you should spend the money you've saved.
Yes.
Effectively because it would help the economy.
Yes.
And the essay I was reading about his was actually about work rather than spending, but the principle actually still applies. So he was sort of saying, effectively, do you work so that you can live, or do you live so that you can work? And in this case, it's like, well, do you spend so that you can live, so you can afford all the things like housing and food and clothing and everything else which goes into living? Or do you live just so that you can spend? Is spending the end goal rather than living?
Yes.
Because if you're making the economy a god in and of itself, well, then you're going to end up with all kinds of strange things which have actually lost the idea that they're all supposed to work together for human flourishing. Yes. You're talking about the economy flourishing rather than human flourishing.
Yes. That's a really helpful corrective. And I think, the way that the economy has dominated the political discourse after Labour come into power, I think we have lost sight of the fact that at the other end of economic decisions are people made in God's image. And that's why we talked about the winter fuel allowance, because that will have an impact on some of the most vulnerable in our communities, whether for good or for ill. There'll be disagreements on that. But I also think if we step even further back and go, okay, from a Christian perspective, our starting point has to be that everything we have in this world is from God. And he created a world of abundance. And the fact that we've got ourselves in a position where in a developed country, we have these massive arguments over, the fact that the government spent its £9 billion reserve multiple times over. There are countries around the world that don't have a reserve because they're in a much worse economic position than we are. But also, I think that the whole principle of it's very clear from the New Testament, from what Jesus says, and also from what Paul teaches in Romans 13, we are to pay our taxes. Yeah. And we are to do so primarily, I wonder, with a view to this is a way of blessing my neighbour, and it's a way of honouring those that God has placed in authority over me. The government have a right to take a proportion of our income and then to spend it in different ways, to set up welfare programs, to incentivize business, to develop the defense of the realm. Like these are ultimately good things, ultimately. And so is my attitude consistent with that? When I think about the economy, when I think about the tax and spend decisions, am I consciously thinking about it not so much from a kind of left or right political lens, but am I first coming at it from a kind of biblical lens of, hold on, Paul says, pay your taxes. Governments have a right to demand that from us.
Yeah, and as part of that, I don't think that we can be objecting if the government are effectively looking to make a tax system fairer, and in particular to look out for those who are most vulnerable. And that was where we were a moment ago with the winter fuel allowance. I guess one of the other big headline makers from the last couple of weeks, which I know you've written about more extensively, is the government have decided not to scrap the limit on benefits at 2 children.
Yeah.
And which in your very provocatively entitled headline, you called the worst social policy ever.
Well, I raised it as a question. I said, is this the worst?
Indeed.
This was prompted by, after a King's speech, you have lots and lots of debates and votes on different measures in the King's speech. And the Scottish National Party placed an amendment that they pushed to a vote, which was to scrap the 2-child benefit limit.
Lib Dems also want to oppose it as well.
Absolutely. And 7 former Labour MPs voted with the Scottish National Party, voted for the amendment. And as a result, Keir Starmer, exercising his newly found political authority, expelled them from the Labour Party, thereby reducing his majority in the House of Commons. He's got such a big majority, he can afford to do this.
Yeah.
And I think that prompted me to go away and sort of have a look at it. And as I say in the piece, I've been aware of the 2-child benefit limit for as long as I've been involved in Christian public policy. And I've always vaguely known that I think this isn't a very good idea, but I've never really thought through why is it a bad idea. And so actually going all the way back to where did this idea come from and why was it implemented and what was the justification and then what's been the kind of result of implementing it. And I honestly and truly believe from everything that I looked at and everything that I read, and I really did try to look at the arguments in favour of the 2-child benefit limit, I came to the conclusion that as a Christian, there is no possible justification or way that you can support the 2-child benefit cap. It just seems to me inconceivable. You might be able to make an attempt at a justification, but I think it would quickly fall down because ultimately this is anti-marriage, it's anti-family, it's anti-having children, all of which, therefore, is opposed to what God has designed and said is good for human flourishing. So I think, although the title of this essay was provocative, I quote at the beginning, the worst social security policy in history, heinous. You could not design a policy better to increase child poverty than this one. And I came to the conclusion that actually all of those people who said those things were right.
I guess the reason why Labour, in theory, have not got rid of it yet, and I imagine that in time they probably will, but I think the reason why they haven't got rid of it yet is because they are looking to maintain that image they're trying to project of fiscal responsibility. And so they don't want to be accused, as before, of spending money they don't have, or kind of, I guess, saying, well, actually, we can have a cut in spending over here when we don't actually have the money to justify it. So that would be their reasoning.
Yes.
But also, we were talking just a moment ago about making sure that the tax system works on behalf of those who are the most vulnerable.
Yes.
And in this, we are talking about children who are growing up in poverty, and that is clearly a group of people within society who are incredibly vulnerable. And we see that Jesus has a particular heart for children, don't
Absolutely.
we?
Yes.
So in Mark chapter 9, and this is admittedly about sort of leading children to sin, but the principle is probably still one which applies. In Mark 9, Jesus talks about a kind of severe penalty on those who effectively lead children astray. And so I think within that, you can see that not only does Jesus have a real heart for children, but that those who harm children will be particularly badly judged. As I think every bone in our body wants them to be. And I guess the practical outworking of this policy, the estimate, which I think you quoted in the piece, was that if they abolished the 2-child cap, well, that would mean 300,000 children being lifted out of poverty. That
sounds like a good idea.
I mean, that seems to me to be well worth the few billion pounds which we would be spending on doing it.
Yeah, and I think that this is part of the problem. I think decisions about this benefit cap have been made from a purely pragmatic and economic position, while underneath that has been a willingness to adopt what is essentially a sort of anti-family, anti-children doctrine. And I think you have to go deeper. You have to go beyond just the economic arguments. And if from a Christian worldview point of view, this is something that just needs to be stressed again and again. While on the one hand, in this gospel age that we live in, biological family, praise God, is not everything. That you find the most incredible family, a spiritual family within the church community, that you're, I would argue, in some ways, united in an even stronger way with your brothers and sisters in Christ than you are with your biological brothers, sisters, or mums, dads, and so on.
Yeah.
At the same time, the answer here isn't that the New Testament prioritizes the church community and family over biological family to such an extent that you drive this wedge between Genesis 1 and 2 and then the rest of the Bible. If you go back to Genesis 1 and 2 and go back to the creation mandate of Genesis 1, it is quite clear that God's good design for this world is that humanity would be built around families, and that you would have a man leave his mum and dad, be united with his wife, and that they would then together act in obedience to the creation mandate and populate the earth. And we have in this country a declining birth rate because more and more people are choosing not to have children. And we have an aging population because we're all living longer. And this is the real challenge for the Labour government. It was the same challenge for the Tory government. Will they lift this cap, not just for pragmatic economic reasons, not just to lift 300,000 children out of poverty, but will they also lift it because they want to encourage men and women in this country to live life in obedience to what God has said is good. That's the real challenge for them. And I fear we continue to have a political class that just will not grapple with how do we best encourage family life in this country? Why is family good? Let's talk about it. Let's say it. And I'm just, it's a huge frustration to me in the 8 years I've been involved in Christian public policy. The whole question of family and biological family and having children, it's just a no-go area nowadays. That's really, really sad.
Yeah. One of the things which I thought you drew up very helpfully in the piece was some of the perhaps unexpected consequences which have come as a result of the policy. So you quoted a stat from BPAS.
Yes.
Which found that 57% of women who were aware and might be impacted by the two-child policy said that then impacted their choice whether to have an abortion or not.
Yeah.
And so there's a real world impact. And I guess also one of the things which actually that is helpful in showing is at Care we work in a variety of different policy areas.
Yes.
But there are these interconnections between them.
That's totally right.
And so it's not that like if you are working say you're working on abortion legislation but that exists in a bubble.
Yes.
Actually maybe part of the way in which we can ensure that more children are born is to work from a completely different angle around poverty.
Absolutely.
And to kind of concentrate our efforts in a different place.
I mean, I remember when I was growing up, I'm one of four, and my parents received child tax credits and benefits for the third and fourth child, which is not the case any longer, but that was the case then. And I mean, I can tell you, my dad was a minister, my mum didn't work at the time, and those benefits were enormously helpful. And the message that it sent was, we recognise that you have more mouths to feed and to care for, and we're going to therefore help you to do that. Because ultimately, having children or not, it's not a neutral thing.
Yeah.
We have to come back to what does the Bible say about this? And the problem becomes that you can't talk about it because you fear being judgmental. The moment you say biological family matters, having children matters, you're immediately making, in some people's minds, a judgment about, for example, single parents.
Yeah.
Even though you're not at all making a judgment about single parents. You're simply trying to reflect what does the Bible teach. But we always feel the need then to cover it with 1,000 caveats. And this is on all of us in the church to get better at talking about this. And I must say, in 2015, when the Conservative coalition-led government introduced and announced the two-child benefit cap, there was a coalition of church ministers and Christian leaders and some of other faiths who came together and said, this will undermine family stability and it will lead to more abortions. And they have been proven right. Good example of the church, I believe, doing what God has called it to do, which is to call out injustice and to call out things that are contrary to God's plan and design. So I've got myself very exercised about the two-child benefit cap, and I did get asked by someone in response to it was, why are you only writing about this now? Why did you not write about it when it was introduced? First of all, CARE has talked about the two-child benefit cap in its major tax reports that it's produced annually for the last 10 years. But secondly, the reason I'm talking about it now is because it came up in Parliament, and we want to provide Christian opposition commentary on current affairs. And thirdly, there is a possibility, as you articulated, that maybe at some point this Labour government will do the right thing and abolish this cap. That would be a wonderful day if that happens.
And it is worth saying, actually, when we are talking about this should not predominantly come across as an attack on Labour. Labour are preserving a policy which was introduced by the Conservatives and the Lib Dems. And so it is not that this is us kind of going in hard on Labour or harder on them than any other party.
No, that's right.
It wasn't their policy in the first place. They've inherited it and they're maintaining it.
Yes, and hopefully we'll end it one day.
Yeah, I feel that they probably will, but I guess we'll see what happens on that.
Yes.
We've just alluded to some other parties.
Yes.
It's not all about Labour.
It's not.
Things are kicking off in the Conservative Party.
Another leadership contest. You know what, Peter? I am just thoroughly uninspired, actually, if I'm honest with you. But yes, so we're talking about the Conservative Party leadership contest.
Indeed.
It's probably worth us just saying these are the candidates.
Yeah, are you going to test me again?
Okay, yes, good. All right, I've got them in front of me. Don't look.
I'm not looking.
Okay, go.
James Cleverly.
Yes.
Priti Patel.
Yes.
Kemi Badenoch.
Yes.
Tom Tugendhat.
Yes. Good pronunciation.
Mel Strong.
Yes.
Robert Jenrick.
Yes, he's done it. They're the 6 candidates who've made it through. A convoluted process will now be followed whereby you have to have loads of votes on the 4th, 9th, 10th, 11th of September to go down to from 6 to 4. Mm-hmm. That's from the Parliamentary Party. The 4 then get to parade themselves at Tory Party conference. Goodness knows what that's going to look like. Votes again from the Parliamentary Party on the 9th to the 10th to whittle it down to 2 candidates. Then it goes to the party membership, except if one candidate at that point drops out, so then you have a coronation, the membership will be denied a vote. Oh, controversial stuff. And we're expecting a winner to be announced. I can't wait for this. On the 2nd of November 2024, we've got months of this beauty parade going on. So what do you make of it, Peter? Come on. You're a lifelong...
No, I'm not.
I knew that would get you going. You are someone who, you told me before off air that you'd sort of read up a little bit on the Tory party leadership contest. So what is going on?
Well, I guess the fallout from the disastrous election performance was always likely to lead to a bit of soul searching. It's been well publicised that there have been some pretty divided factions within the Conservative Party for years at this point.
It was ever thus.
Yes, although it has felt particularly bad.
Yes, that's true.
I mean, this is now a tangent, but you sort of think, gosh, Cameron did do quite well to hold the thing together in 5 years of coalition government.
Yeah.
I mean, you compare that with the disaster you've had probably in the last 5 years. So you've got these 6 candidates. They represent different bits within the party. Probably the one name who has not made it to this point, but who has made a lot of noise, perhaps more so than just for anyone else, is Suella Braverman. She has, I think, effectively been seen to be such a divisive figure that the Conservatives will not put her forward. And even some of her biggest supporters have deserted her and gone over to Robert Jenrick instead.
Yes. And his conversion to the sort of anti-immigration candidate in this is absolutely remarkable, given that when he became housing minister, all the chatter was he was an ally of Rishi Sunak's and he was there to keep an eye on Suella Braverman, who was the Home Secretary under Rishi Sunak. And so this kind of sudden emergence of him where he quit his job over the fact that he didn't think the government was doing enough to tackle illegal immigration, I think is one of the most fascinating subplots of this whole kind of election contest.
So the 2 favourites currently are Jenrick and Kemi Badenoch. I think part of the reason for that is if it does go to the membership tend to lean further to the right than the Parliamentary Party do. And you've seen that in the last 2 times it's gone to the membership. So if you go back to 2 contests ago, I'm not including Rishi Sunak's coronation.
It's hard to remember, isn't it? It's been quite a lot.
So you had Boris being elected by the members over Jeremy Hunt.
Yes.
And then after that, you had Liz Truss being elected over Rishi Sunak.
Yes, again by the members.
Which was by the members and was in contrast A to the Parliamentary Party and B to what probably the country at large wanted at that time.
Yes.
So membership tends to skew to the right. that leaves Kemi and Robert Jenrick in pretty good positions. Priti Patel is pitching herself as a unity candidate. James Cleverly, again, as a unity candidate. Tom Tugendhat probably represents more of a centrist position, although the fact that he has served in the military always tends to play well with members as well.
What about Mel Stride? Where's he come from?
Well, yeah,
who is Mel Stride?
I don't think that Mel Stride is going to get very far. I mean, I don't think it will be quite like another Remen Chishti moment where he secured the backing of only himself running from the leadership. But yeah, I would be very surprised if Mel Stride makes it deep within the contest.
Yes.
Yeah, I completely get what you say when you're saying you're not feeling massively inspired.
But that's partly because, this is just the party's got 120 seats. They're not in power. This is a kind of very much a kind of nasal gazing activity. And their challenge is they've got to look out to the country.
Do you mean a navel gazing?
Sorry,
as opposed to a nasal gazing activity.
Sorry, yes, they're not looking up their nose. I mean, you're right, yes. You're continuing your ministry of correcting my misuse of well-known phrases. So thank you for that. But yeah, you're absolutely right. I mean, I think from a Christian point of view as well, for me, I want there to be a decent opposition.
Yeah.
And I think it is important that political parties from time to time, do this kind of, internal thought process and figure out, well, who are we? And this whole thing of unity candidates and so on and so forth. I mean, the fact is that the Tory party has been at war with each other far more than they've been at war with the other parties within Parliament, I would argue. And so maybe this is a chance for a fresh start and for someone to come and say, okay, we're going to focus on critiquing the policies put forward by Labour. And that's how the British parliamentary system is supposed to work. So, please God, may we come out with a effective and functioning opposition and a party that can put forward a platform of policies that are coherent and consistent with its ideology.
Yeah, and I guess the leader who they pick here is going to reveal a lot about their strategy for the next 5 years going towards the next election.
Yeah.
And it's going to be really fascinating to see whether the Conservatives think that actually they can build so much that they can win the next election, or whether they're looking more to kind of just secure their position and then go again in 10 years' time.
Yes.
I think with those candidates, some of them are good speakers, but are perhaps not the right person for this time. So I think Kemi Badenoch, for instance, is a very good speaker and has a lot of potential. Whether she has another setting beyond kind of sounding quite cross with the wokies, I don't know. And so it would be no bad thing potentially for her to cut her teeth in one of the kind of major shadow positions.
So who do you want, or not want, but who do you think will get it from that list?
I think Jenrick might get it.
You think Robert Jenrick might become the new leader of the Conservative Party?
I think it'll be either Jenrick or Badenoch.
Okay, interesting.
I think Jenrick probably has more credibility within the parliamentary party than Kemi Badenoch does.
Do you think the membership will go for him over? You said earlier they skew right. He's more right than she is.
Well, I think it depends, doesn't it? Because it depends on whether the parliamentary party throw in their lot behind one right-wing candidate.
Yes, or
whether they think they can get both.
And interestingly, behind Robert Jenrick is a Christian MP. Danny Kruger is apparently running his campaign. That's what the sources tell me.
Who was a Suella Braverman supporter before.
That's true.
Kind of shows the pivoting away.
But there's a Christian influence within Kemi Badenoch's world as well, although apparently she herself no longer believes in God in the same way because of a really tragic incident with a friend that massively impacted her kind of faith. She calls herself a cultural Christian. I just want to put on record, there is no such thing. Cultural Christianity is, honestly, we should do a podcast on this at some stage. It's massively winding me up at the moment. What matters is, are you converted to Christ? Not, I like some of the principles of Christianity.
Yes, it would be a fascinating conversation we could have with Tom Holland on that point.
From our sister podcast.
Yeah, quite. For those who would love to think about that question a bit more, I think I wrote a longer piece when Richard Dawkins calls himself a cultural Christian, so you can dig into that one. I think some of those who are pitching themselves as unity candidates are not necessarily that much.
It's just the kind of thing you say, isn't
I
it?
don't think Priti Patel's going to be able to run that as her brand very successfully. I think Cleverly might, because he's been in various top positions.
Let's imagine for a moment, okay, so you're a Christian, you normally vote Conservative, you've got this leadership contest going on, you're a member of the party. What are just some of the things that you should be thinking about? And this is the question we've got to answer. This is the added value that we bring to these conversations.
Yeah.
So, as a Christian, what should we make of the Tory party leadership contest?
The thing I think I would love to see is Conservatives thinking about the language they use. So not just trying to sound as right-wing as possible to appeal to members, which is exactly what Liz Truss and indeed Boris Johnson did before this point, but actually looking to provide a nuanced, wise position to difficult problems. And I think, less with Sunak, but particularly with the two before him, the Conservatives have had leaders who have talked this ridiculously big game, have been all style and no substance, and have not been able to deliver any kind of credible policy. And that was particularly borne out with the Liz Truss affair, where she could come out with all these big statements and, oh wait, you've crashed the economy within 45 days. So I guess I would love to see a leader who is wise, who would do a good job of promoting good and restraining evil, but who also is not just looking to pander to an audience, but who is willing to actually speak the truth about what is going on.
I would add in humility as well. I think a willingness to be honest about previous failings and not try to pretend as if everything just went perfectly. I mean, this is what Liz Truss is now doing. She's basically saying, not me, Gov. None of it's my fault. And I on the one hand, I don't agree. I get it. On the other hand, I think, come on, show some humility. We're frail human beings. Even the very best of these candidates has made mistakes, will make mistakes. As a Christian, I get that, I expect that, and I want to show grace. I want to not treat people as they deserve to be treated. And so I would love to hear some humility from the candidates in this contest, in this internal debate. And that, if I was in a position where I was going to vote for one of them, and I'm not going to vote for one of them because I'm not a Conservative Party member, and I'm not planning to become one, then I would love to hear some humility. And again, we're really coming back to the character over skills, aren't we? There's such an important Christian emphasis on character matters as much, if not more, than your actual creative policy ideas or ability to communicate well. And that, common grace does mean that you can have some good character qualities outside of being united to Jesus.
Yeah, I'm almost coming to the conclusion that in some ways I'd love our political leaders to stop politicking. It'd be much better if on some of this stuff they stopped playing politics and aka trying to make themselves sound as tough as possible. We all see it when it comes to, say, the immigration debate.
Well, that's right.
It's like, well, I'm going to stop the boats and I'm going to sink the boats and actually I'm going to construct a wall over France so they can't send any
Honestly,
boats.
it will not be long before someone says I'm going to build a wall. Well, and I think again on that issue, I would want to hear. I have got no issue with a political party saying we need to stop illegal immigration.
Yeah.
But what I have an issue with is how do you communicate it?
Exactly.
Can you communicate about that in a compassionate way that recognizes even those who try to enter illegally, which is wrong, that they are still human beings?
Completely.
We must be able to manage that. So again, that would be one of the tests I would include from a Christian perspective.
Yeah.
Can they talk about a controversial thing like stopping illegal immigration in a way that is compassionate, in a way that is human?
Yeah, absolutely. Is someone genuinely recognizing the God-given dignity of every human life, particularly with those who they disagree with, and with those whom they are looking to achieve a different policy outcome for? And that goes in immigration. It goes even actually on some things which are, I guess, causes which care might do a bit more thinking about. So, I have written various things for care on say, the issue of gender. And I have very strong beliefs informed by Scripture in terms of what is God-given truth. and what is the best way forward and what is not the best way forward. But even with those with whom I disagree, I need to work out a way of speaking which recognises that within them they have a God-given dignity and an inherent worth. Yeah. And so rather than just looking to bash people, I need to remain firm around my convictions.
Yes.
And dare I say it, also speak with civility. That classic phrase.
Somehow we've ended up back on this wretched phrase, convicted civility. Yeah, but a great phrase, but wretched as well. Look, there's, as ever, loads more we could say, but let's draw this particular podcast to a close. I want to actually finish by asking anyone who is watching and listening to this, if you are not yet a subscriber to CARE's YouTube channel, Care.org UK, why not subscribe? We've got a growing subscriber base, which is really exciting. More and more people are joining. And if you subscribe, you'll get up-to-the-minute updates on latest podcast episodes. But you will also be able to access some of our other fantastic content as well, from the talks that our team have given in different churches, to our Foundations for a Christian Worldview series, which we're going to repackage for small groups, to other more historical content, films about who we are, about CARE's history. So subscribe to CARE's YouTube channel, as it's like your gateway drug to the wonderful world of CARE. So that's what I'd love you to do. If you're watching and you're enjoying this content, subscribe to our YouTube channel. Our goal is to get past 1.24 thousand subscribers on YouTube. Let's push all the way up. Let's get to 2,000 subscribers, and maybe you could be part of that journey. So that's my heartfelt plea. If you've enjoyed this content, subscribe, spread the word, make sure you become a loyal follower of the Engage podcast. It was pretty good, wasn't it?
Very good.
Yeah, off the top of the head as well. Great, Peter, it's been a pleasure.
As always.
Parliament's now on holiday, and so we will be continuing with the podcast, and I think we should be talking again about some of the different pieces of legislation, thinking about an assisted suicide bill again in the House of Lords. We should cover that at some point. So lots to come in this podcast, so I look forward to being back with you in a few weeks' time.
Very good. I'll see you soon.
See you soon.